Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to call the August 27th Board of Trustees Special Meeting Budget Study Session to order. It was 4:30 when I hit the gavel. It is 4:31 now. At this time, we'd like to start the Pledge of Allegiance. If I could get Mr. Jeff Wood, would you please join us in the leading the flag salute this afternoon? Thank you. Madam Secretary, could you please take roll?
Virginia Baxter. Here. Vivian Malauulu.
Here.
Udawakjo Intuk will be late. And Doug Otto.
Here.
At this time, we will hear public comments on any agenda items. Madam Secretary, did anyone submit a speaking card?
There are no speaker cards.
There are no speakers at this time, so we're going to move on to item 1.5, the Annual Budget Development Overview. And at this time, I'd like to turn the floor over to Vice President Drinkwine.
Thank you so much, President Malauulu. It's my pleasure this afternoon to lead the Board of Trustees through an in-depth review of our proposed adopted budget for 2019-20. Before I get started on the presentation, I want to note a couple of things. One is that we just recently completed year-end closing and the final determination of some of these numbers. So there may be small differences between what we discussed today and what's presented to you for your approval on September 11th. They are not material differences, however. And it's just a couple of last-minute items that came through right at the end of closing the books. And the other is that the effort of my team to put together a budget in any year is phenomenal, and I really want to acknowledge their efforts and their expertise in being able to bring a budget to you today for your review. You have attached to your agenda was the presentation, as well as the unrestricted general fund, a list of all funds. We've also provided some other supplementary materials that as we get to them, I'll share with you what they are. You have them all at your areas, as well as they are available for the public. This evening, we're going to talk about the budget development cycle, what goes into the budget development, what are the goals, the plans, the priorities that the budget has to be aligned with. We'll discuss the assumptions for the development of the budget. We'll focus on the unrestricted general fund. That is the fund that contains all the primary operations for the district. And we'll also touch on some other funds. Please feel free to interrupt me at any time with any questions. There are three major separate budget development cycles. The first is the development of the state budget. You'll see in a future slide that the primary source of our revenue is state apportionment dollars, and that's dependent entirely on the state's budget. In January of each year, the governor will release his proposal for the budget for the following year. In May, the governor releases the May revision. The May revision will reflect any negotiations on the elements contained in the budget, as well as more accurate state revenue numbers. Property taxes will have been collected. The cost of living adjustment, which is statutorily set, will be known, and we'll have a lot more information. The state enacts their budget in June, but it's important to also note that trailer legislation that contains the policy often determines exactly how much our district gets out of the revenues is not released until sometime later, July or August. That's important because we first present our tentative budget to you in June, before the state's budget is even enacted. So there's a lot of moving parts, and the budget you can consider as a living document, that it is always being adjusted to reflect the most current and the best data. The second cycle relates to our district's actual data. That, for instance, in January, when the governor's releasing the budget, that's when we're getting some preliminary spring enrollment numbers. So we're halfway through the year, and we forecast our enrollment, but really by then we know, okay, what happened in fall, what's enrolled for spring. It gives us an opportunity to update it. And then we update it quarterly throughout the year. So as we're moving forward and we get better enrollment numbers, that we're always revisiting it. Simultaneously, we have efforts on the department and VP planning. So the district-wide planning process is hopefully concluding by May so that we can include those priorities in the following year's budget. Gives us a very short time frame to respond to those resource requests and those priorities. But May obviously is a very busy time for us. And then we're right back in the summer looking at the new year. So we're always adjusting for actual numbers. And then the third cycle is what the state requires us to do, what's contained in the Ed Code. So that means our tentative budget in June, our adopted budget in September, and then we have quarterly reports throughout. We have a first quarter update in November, a second quarter update in February, and a third quarter update in May. So that throughout the year, we're able to provide you with a status update on what those budgets were, what changes did we have to make, and what do we project we're going to end up with at the end of the year. And so looking at that cycle, it would be my recommendation that as we look at the budget for next year, that we come back together again in April to look at the budget development for the year 2021. I mentioned that the budget considers board goals, strategic plan goals, and institutional priorities. Our accreditation standards actually require that our budget be aligned with institutional planning. And so that explains why in every single budget presentation, we'll have several slides dedicated to showing how those expenditures and how those specific activities are tied to the institutional planning. Obviously, the Board of Trustee goals are also considered in the development of this budget. I believe that the last Board of Trustee goals were adopted in August of 2017. And so we do our best to align with those goals. And of course, our strategic plan with the goals of innovation for equitable student success, accelerating college readiness, et cetera, are also a focus. And I know that we had a recent presentation that talked about how those goals are aligned with the Chancellor's Office Vision for Success, as well as the institutional priorities. So we have alignment all the way from the Chancellor's Office through our planning, and all of that is reflected in the resulting budget. And so we do identify a combination of major programs and new programs and how they align with those various goals. For instance, College Promise 2.0 aligns with our strategic plan and several other areas. While it's obviously higher enrollment will help our fiscal health, since it's not specifically serving fiscal health, you can see that's a good example of how we do identify which goals it actually serves, and we don't just plug them in there. You'll also see efforts to increase completions reflected in there, student-centered scheduling improvements, all of these activities that were identified in planning as being necessary to better serve our students and serve our vision and our missions. On slide 10, you can see that this is where we're reflecting our incredibly successful Viking summer voyage. our welcome centers, our Starfish early alerts, that this is where you can see where we've captured those initiatives and those activities. Another primary purpose of the budget is to identify a reserve. Our board policy 6010 requires specifically a minimum 5.5% reserve. The Chancellor's Office institutional effectiveness goal is 9.5%. So that means that our total goal for reserves is 15%. 15
Vice President Drinkwine?
Yes.
When was this institutional effective goal set? Because I never remember hearing about it before.
The institutional effectiveness goal, I believe, was set about 4 years ago. I can come back to you with the formal plan, but the Chancellor's Office convened a working group on institutional effectiveness, and it was during that process that they established the 9.5% requirement.
Did they require it to be cumulative, or are they just 9.9 or 9.5?
The 9.5 is intended to be additive to our reserve, and it is separately calculated with each budget year. And the calculation is unrestricted expenditures, so 15% of that is our goal for the minimum. So our goal is 5.5%. The Chancellor's Office goal is an additional 3.5%.
So the cumulative, it should be 9.5%.
Correct.
Okay.
The would be 15. It's additive. On
I understand. I guess the institutional effectiveness recommendation of 9.5%, its recommendation is 9.5%, not 15%.
correct. Correct.
So we're above and beyond the effectiveness goal.
My understanding is that it was an additional 9.5% plus our goal. The 9.5%, I will say, is not statutorily required.
It's just a recommendation.
Correct. We do have a budget advisory committee. It is a shared governance committee. And in that committee, we develop our assumptions, and we have participation from groups throughout the district. Not all those assumptions are developed within the committee, however, and a very good example of this is our FTES goal, which is developed by academic affairs in conjunction with input from their deans, departments, and faculty. And so annually, they take on this very large task of looking at what our current enrollment, classes, and staffing are, and the any new additional curriculum that's coming online, and any opportunities for expansion. I'll go into some depth about the student-centered formula in a few slides, funding formula, but it is important that by time we exit the hold harmless funding in 2022-23, that we reach 20,000 FTES in order to be eligible for the large college funding. It's worth about $1.3 million to us. And so that is one of the goals. We have several goals connected to the formula, but this is one of the goals, and it is something that we are making steady progress at, and we'll be able to share with you some data in just a little bit.
Can you tell us just a little bit about the large college threshold, when it came to be, how we've done with that over the last half a dozen years? I know it wasn't an issue, then it kind of became an issue, and we obviously want to be a large college, and the threshold is 20,000, I think, FTES.
Correct. So the threshold is 20,000 FTES. That moves you from being in the mid-range into the upper range. And for us in 1819, the difference between the large and the medium college status is $1.3 million. But I'm going to ask Dr. Scott to address the evolution of that.
Okay, historically going back, we have hit the large college status many years. Going back to 2005 and 6, we hit it. just barely over. 2006 we did, 2007 we did, 2008. We did all the way up until 2012-13, where we missed it by not too much. We were at 19,641. And then we missed it in 13-14 again. We had gone down below that to 19,189. In 14-15, we went back up and did hit the large college status. We hit it again in 15-16, and we hit it in 16-17, but we hit it that year by bringing in FTES from both of the summers. And you know how you can do that. So we wouldn't have done that well, but we pulled in the summers. And that was actually a good decision, because it did give us money that year, but it also set that as the hold harmless. So we were held harmless at a point that would have been higher than it would have been otherwise.
And with the new funding formula, didn't they initially say something about the summer shifts, and they were going to eliminate them? I think that you couldn't do it, but I think they backed away from that. And
The initial proposal for the funding formula would have eliminated the opportunity to do summer shifts. So we can do summer shifts, but under the new funding formula, we're not funded on a single year's FTES. We are rather funded on a 3-year rolling average. So when you're averaging 3 years, the impact of the summer shift is far less. And you have to have a much more complex projection to determine how, when you're shifting the summer, how does that impact you, not just this year, but next year. And it does become more complex and less valuable. But if I may, I would like to allow Dr. Scott to talk a little bit about the success we're having with meeting our goals. As the slide shows you, for 1920, the goal for resident FTES is 19,375, but as we are starting school this week, we have some good news.
Okay, we're doing reasonably well, and it's possible we could hit large college status before the year that we have the goal projected, 2022. In summer, we were up about 10%, so that gives us a good start. And then for fall, we're currently up about 5.5%. It's too early to know whether that's going to hold through census. We have late start classes. We have positive attendance that come in from non-credit and some of our credit classes. But we did determine earlier today that if we look at where we were with summer, our projection for summer, which is pretty close at this point, our projection for fall, and if we stick with where we were last winter and where we were last spring, we're only going to be about 200 off the large college status this year. And so if we can maintain and hold on to the students, the new students that we got, and do a really good job with retaining students, we have a chance at getting very close this year. So a lot of it really relies on our ability to maintain those students, and that is going to be a collaborative effort for all of us, and something I'll be talking to the Academic Senate about on Friday. Yeah, it's going to be a collaborative goal for all of us to retain these students, especially the new ones that have come in.
I will say, too, that Dr. Munoz deserves a great deal of credit. The summer Viking voyage that really helped walk our high school students through the enrollment process has also been incredibly successful. And I pointed out that it was on the list of new activities, new initiatives that we highlighted. And it is an example of a dedication of resources that is paying off. And I don't know if you wanted to share, Dr. Munoz, about the number that you identified that went through the summer Viking voyage.
So as you know, we implemented some new high school outreach strategies last year, and they definitely paid quite well in terms of the increase in enrollment. So when we look at the year-over-year increase from our high schools from fall 18 to fall 19, we see about a 43% increase. So there's about 1,000 more full-time high school students registered this year than the previous year. So we deployed staff out to the high schools, did on-site applications, on-site orientation, on-site educational planning. So our counselors went out, did the full wraparound services. And that's something that the counselors used to do, but we moved away from over the years. And so now it's not anything new. It's just returning to some of the high impact practices that the college used to always have. We also realized that you're onboarding new students, so what are we going to do to really provide some intensive services? So we implemented a Viking summer voyage for over 600 students. For an inaugural summer voyage, that's a very high number. I can tell you most of the schools around here average about 500 students, so we're above schools that have been doing this for several years. And so it's a 2-week summer intensive bridge that focuses on math skill development, counseling, career planning, educational planning, as well as student affairs, student life component. And then we also implemented Viking Welcome Days. We recognize not all of these students could attend 2 weeks and make that kind of commitment. So we did 1-day extended orientations that last about 5 hours to give students kind of just a uptick in their start here at Long Beach City College, and we had another 600 students go through that. So we're really focusing in on the first year supports and all the transition activities, to Dr. Scott's point, to make sure that we hold on to these students. We don't want to add all these students into the queue and then lose them after one semester. So we're working really hard to partner with academic affairs to make sure that we retain the students that we just put all this effort into recruiting.
And I would just add, it's all the more remarkable because of what we've done and what we've accomplished, because of the fact that enrollments everywhere are going down, and therefore you're not saying, oh, we want to stay where we are, because if we do that, we're gonna have slipped. And not only that, but our good friends at Long Beach Unified are working really hard to send their students to 4-year schools, and that means that we get fewer of them. Not that it's wrong, but for them to want to do that. But so there's all kinds of forces that are in our way of achieving. I don't even want to talk about large college stuff, but just our enrollments. And so these are real amazing accomplishments. Really good.
Okay. I'd also like to add a couple other things, if I may. We've had a 3-year enrollment management plan that I think we've done a very good job at meeting most of the objectives. The work that's been done by the faculty with curriculum has been amazing. As I reported on College Day, over 600 items were approved through the curriculum process this last year. And I failed to mention on College Day, and I should have, is all the work done by institutional effectiveness and Tableau. We are now able to push out targeted emails to students telling them what classes they need. These are available, which has been a really big help to us. And also, lastly, and not least, but is the growth of adult ed and non-credit. We've increased it really about 100%, and it's an area where we're not currently serving the community in ways that we could, and we want to continue to grow that, and so that's another area that's helping us with our FTES. Thank you.
And so when we look at our assumptions, and on slide 16, you'll note that I do have a corrected slide for you. Our resident target, as we just discussed, was 19,375. With our non-resident of 343, our total target is just over 19,007. We do every year anticipate a 0.5% deficit from the state. When I use deficit here, I'm talking about when the state has not enough money to fully fund all community college districts, and so they essentially prorate the apportionment to each of us. There have been years when it's been as high as 5%, and so 0.5% is rather less conservative than I am entirely comfortable with. But what that means, and I'll be showing this to you as we look at how we improved our year end, that represents about $600,000 to us. And we do employ a total cost of ownership approach to budgeting. That means that we look at operation of an entire program. We recognize that when you're adding a person, you're adding an office, you're adding a computer, you're adding a program. We also consider all vacant positions to be filled. Unless we say we are not filling a position, which is a very, it is a very important consideration if we determine we are not filling a position. It does not happen often. We instead say that if we have a position, we budget it for the full year. So, say we have a few vacancies and it takes us 6 months to recruit and fill, we essentially save half a year. Or in the case of reorganization, if we know that we have to leave a position vacant while we reorganize, we will naturally have some savings. And you'll see the result of that as well. We do have some STRS and PERS increases. We have a total of just over $1.5 million in STRS and PERS increases. And this is despite the relief we received from the state, which I'll discuss in a moment. We do have a health and welfare premium increase. This is exceptional. I have to say that our health benefit plan is very well managed, and we've been able to hold the growth in the cost of that program. The 2019-20 cost of living adjustment.
Vice President Drinkwine, I'm sorry to interrupt. I have a question, but I'm not sure if my question is appropriate for this slide or a future slide, so maybe you can tell me it's coming or it would fit. Actually, I have two questions. One, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that the SERP savings from the SERP that we offered last year would be reflected in this year's budget. Is that correct?
The SERP savings are reflected in two ways. So we have the ongoing SERP savings simply by having a person with more experience at the higher level of step and call being replaced with a newer person with less. So that's an ongoing until they essentially grow up. So you typically have savings over a 3 to 5 year period after the SERP because you're still experiencing that difference as that person advances. But what we were really able to do with the SERP last year is because of the timing, we were able to achieve a few $1 million in savings through the use of adjunct faculty. The fund did not require us to use full-time faculty to replace them until the 1920 year. So that allowed us to have one-time savings. So you're right, every year will reflect the ongoing savings from the SERP, but we did capture quite a few more savings in 18-19 in one-time savings.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And I may have misunderstood at a previous board meeting, and I don't remember who reported it, if it was you or Dr. O'Malley, but I know that it was reported that the SERP savings that we had in the 2018-2019 academic year, it was actually reported as savings in that year. They were the SERPs that were offered, they were reported in that year. But that was incorrect, right? There shouldn't have been, we had offered the SERPs last year, and there shouldn't have been any SERP savings reflected in last year's budget. It would have been for this year's budget, correct?
So the SERP was effective July 1st, 2018. And so...
I'm sorry, I misspoke. 2017-2018 SERP would have been reflected in the 2018-2019.
Correct. That's
Okay.
absolutely correct. That initial big chunk of savings is reflected in 2018-19. And I'm actually going to be able to show you what that immediate impact was. But it was about $3 million being able to replace them with adjunct. But then again, we do have an ongoing, just natural savings because as we fill those positions, they are folks who are lower on the salary schedule.
Okay, because I do distinctly remember that those SERP savings were reported in the 2017, I'm sorry, what year are we?
It would have been 18-19.
2017-2018 school year, when we offered the SERP, that's when those savings were reported as saying we've saved this much. But it shouldn't have been, right? It would have gone into effect 2018-2019, correct?
My recollection, because I actually joined the district right when we offered the SERP, that it was a very short time frame. And so before we had offered the tentative budget had already basically gone to press. And then when we did the adopted budget, that's when you really saw the swing in the 2018-19 adopted budget. So I'm not sure about whether it had attempted to be captured in 2017-18, but I can assure you that the 18-19 change was definitely reflected in the 18-19 budget.
Okay, got it. Thank you. I have one additional question, and again, if this is not the appropriate place in your presentation, redirect me and I'll wait. But it has to do with, so one of the things that I have been looking into is hiring of personnel coming in at top pay. And the reason why that kind of caught my attention is because I'm familiar with the step and the tier and the way the breakdown in district personnel budget goes. But I'm concerned because I have noticed that we are hiring deans and we're hiring, I think it's really just been deans actually, that have come in at top pay, but then there's no wiggle room for them later. And then I know certain departments in our district have had extreme turnover very quickly, but then we hire somebody else at top pay to replace them. So I'm just concerned where that is in the budget and the impact that that has on our budget in terms of retention. First of all, if we do retain them, what's the next step after that if they come in at higher pay? And then when we have issues in that department, which causes some of those deans, I mean, I think we had 4 deans in one particular department within 8 months, and then they were being hired at high pay each time, and then there were, just different issues. And I know that as a trustee, it's not my job to micromanage or get in the weed or, go in there and find out what's going on, but when you see things like that and you're discussing a budget, I'd like to know what the process is and what goes into consideration with that.
Certainly. I'll address the budget question, and then perhaps I can hand it over to Vice President Duran to discuss the negotiations that may result in somebody coming in a higher step. When we budget for the mid-range. So if you have, for instance, a position that would have 5 steps, we would budget at 3. And that is done from a conservative standpoint. We are always conservative as we approach our budgets. And because we do know that some positions come in at a higher step, we budget at the mid-range, and so that protects us and protects our budget because it averages out. But if I may ask Vice President Duran to address how that comes about.
Sure. What I think you may be referring to is maybe some recent hires in enrollment services. It's a very technical job. It requires a high level of experience, and individuals from that area command top of the market. So there was a dean that was brought in at a higher rate in that area. At the same time, there was another dean brought in student services who was brought in at the first or second step. And we also had some academic associate deans who were brought in at the second or third step. And it's an 11-step salary schedule. So I'm not sure if those are the positions you were referring to. When we do look at bringing individuals in, it is a combination of being competitive, making sure we're looking at a level of skills not only that we're needing, but what's out in the marketplace, and other tangible things that we can judge. We also do look to ensure that as they are placed with their other colleagues, that it's as fair as possible, but there are going to be areas where we are going to have to bring in people higher just to bring in the talent that we need to address the concerns and the work that needs to be done. I'm happy to provide you, I don't have it in front of me, a list of where academic administrators have been placed, perhaps on a scattergram of the salary schedule. I can provide that for the board. If that will be helpful to you, just so visually you can see exactly where the most recent, and say the last year or whatever time period you wish, have been placed, so we can look at that.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I am specifically referring to A&R and also, and again, if I'm not articulating my concern properly, perhaps you can anticipate where I'm trying to get and you can help me get there. But it's been put on my radar, and I want to make sure that we are being prudent in terms of our hiring, particularly when a few years ago we separated the department where we had A&R became one department, and I think, was it financial services or enrollment services? So A&R was split up, and so, work was done to hire people and to fill staff, but then now it's going back to the model that we had before. Is that correct? We're returning to what we were doing before?
Go ahead.
So, Dr. Munoz, before you respond, I just want to know how that impacts the budget. So what we had before, we had enrollment services and admissions and records that were separate and worked together, and then we combined the two, and then I'm really familiar with a lot of the problems that happen. In fact, we've talked about it at board meetings before. We've had a lot of personnel changes. We've had, people that were hired that, we're just not very familiar with the system and the position they were brought in. But then now we're going back to the model that we had before. So what impact do all of those changes have on the budget?
Sure. So, and again, I'm fairly new, so I don't want to speak with full understanding of what might have happened 6 or 7 years ago. So I'm going to share with what I my fact finding and what I've been able to assess, and then kind of where we're at right now. So there was a decision several years ago to consolidate into this one department model called enrollment services. So historically, admissions and records and financial aid, which are both very highly regulatory but different regs, right, environments, got blended into one service model. But the number of administrators, I don't know back then, but looking at right now from what we had with this blended model to the separation, we haven't changed the number of administrators. We've just basically focused the supervisor's responsibilities to focus on the key areas. So whereas before you had an enrollment services director that was overseeing both financial aid and admissions with this blended responsibilities, we're separating those responsibilities so that the one director is focusing solely on admissions and records and really being that competent content expert, serving as the registrar for the college. And now we have a director of financial aid who's really focusing on getting us through our audit findings and getting those corrective action measures put in place and all the other issues that we've had in financial aid. And then we have still the dean over both those areas, along with other components like scholarship, international students, other areas as well. So the actual net number of administrators in the area has not changed. What's changed is the focus of the job descriptions and how they're working. So we're running 2 departments now, not the blended supervisory responsibility, because what I saw in my assessment is that a supervisor tended to be more expert in one area or the other, so they had this additional responsibility. So let's say my whole career I was in admissions and records, and now I'm responsible for supervising financial aid. I may not have the knowledge or that expertise to fully guide the staff with their work processes, workflows, et cetera. So then that area kind of suffered because this person in this role who had blended responsibilities was stronger in this area and not in that. And so all we've done is separated the areas so that there's a stronger focus, and the folks that we've been hiring instead of, like I said, that director of enrollment services, we're hiring them as director of admissions and records or directors of financial aid, so that it's a very focused set of responsibilities. I don't know if I explained that well, but.
And if I might, if you recall that, what Dr. Munoz is referring to, the position was an executive dean, which is at a higher level. So that was downgraded to a dean so that those savings could then be put into subject matter experts in financial aid, and the other area as a director level, higher, more technical, more skilled managers.
That's outstanding, and I remember that. I remember downgrading that position, and I remember Dr. Romali shared with us the budget savings. Thank you for the clarification. One additional question with that. So, and I don't know if it's 4 or 8. I can't remember. I printed up a couple of the, so I've got the executive dean of enrollment services contract. I pulled it from December of 2017 that we had hired. And then that position is the one that was, kind of collapsed, maybe. I don't know what a good word to describe it is. And then I've got I pulled the other contracts. One of the reasons why I'm following up with this is because I'm really concerned that we're hiring from the outside, which is not a problem. We want qualified, we want as it's been said, the Yodas of A&R and the Yodas of enrollment services. But then when they get here, we do want them to produce, and we want them to be productive. So if they fail to do that, I'm just wondering what impact that has on the morale of the existing managers and directors who perhaps are not considered for those positions. Because I know that we've hired several deans from the outside, but then we haven't hired from within, or we haven't taken care of our own staff who's been in the trenches, who's been in the work, is familiar with the system and the work processes. So that concerns me, especially when it has a fiscal impact. So if we're hiring people, if we're bringing people in at top pay for dean positions, but then we've got our own staff who is there in a manager position or a director position, and we start dividing things up, that does have an impact on morale, and that does have an impact on the budget. So perhaps this is a discussion that should be a little more thorough at another time with different, parties involved, but it is something that I would like the administration to just be a little bit more aware of, because the optics are bad when you see such a high turnaround in one particular department. Actually, one of the most important critical departments on campus, enrollment services, admissions, and records, we wouldn't be in business if those departments didn't do their job. So the optics are bad when there's been such a high turnover in personnel, when people are being brought in at top pay and they don't last, and then we've got our own staff who's been here perhaps for a long time. So I just want more of a concerted effort that the college would put into developing the managers and the deans that we have, the managers, directors that we have in place into those positions as deans, without having to, in essence, stress the budget. I hope that makes sense too. I'm trying to understand what you guys are saying, and I know you're making an effort to understand what I'm saying.
No, that's very well said. I don't know if we mentioned this at College Day. President Malauulu and the board might be very interested in the improved results. Can you speak to the improved results in the area?
So, as you know, financial aid has had a lot of challenges. We had a lot of work that needed to do. There were some significant audit findings in the area that were directly attributed to the people. I'm going to pause my comments for that, but there's a lot of challenges in the area. So, bringing in new leadership, what we've been able to see in just 1 year, we went from, and these are real hard numbers, so in the 18-19 year at the first disbursement, we distributed about $2.4 million to 2,169 students. This coming Friday, we are on track to disperse $6.2 million to 5,200 plus students. So part of that is to bring in folks that have the ability to move the institution forward with these types of outcomes. I can tell you, as a new vice president coming in, what I was seeing in enrollment services really frightened me. For a school this size to be dispersing that little amount of money, I was very proud to say, I'm kind of a competitive, and I have a colleague at Pasadena City College that I keep an eye on social media. So I posted my figures, and she posted her figures today, and she said Pasadena City College dispersed the exact same amount of money we did. And that's where we should be. We should be at the same level as El Camino, Santa Monica, Pasadena, because those are colleges that are similar in size to us and need, right, in terms of who they serve. So part of it is, like I said, we had to look at the area and what we could do to improve the systems, because like I said, it's a huge jump to go from $2 million to $6 million in 1 year in the first disbursement. And that was a full team effort. That was not just a dean, that is everyone. At College Day, I acknowledge Maggie Huerta, I acknowledge Farcio, a lot of classified staff that really helped get us to that point. But that was a huge leadership change in that area to be able to move in that direction.
I appreciate that, and I remember that, and Dr. Amali, you and I, we had a very specific meeting about that. So I remember when that was happening, and I share in your spirit of competitiveness, especially with other colleges, so thank you. I know, Trustee Otto, and I know that you wanted to respond to that, or you were, Dr. Amali, did you want to comment? Okay, yes, Trustee Otto.
Just a couple points about that. I watched from a distance all the enrollment management stuff that was going on. And the first thing that we need to remember is when we hire people, we don't just say, oh, we got to get somebody good. We go through a process that makes people from the outside compete with people from the inside, and then decisions are made based on the quality of the individuals. You know, in a lot of places, that's not the way it works. It's like, let's get this guy. And so there's a very stylized process, and that's all for the better. Eventually, you are trusting that you're going to make good decisions that way. Always, we want to be both efficient, meaning that we pay the right amount of money, or not no more than we have to, but we also want to be effective. And effectiveness is very, very important. And then the question is, how do you know whether you're being efficient and effective? Well, one of the ways is you figure out how much money you're dispersing and why are you doing that. And when you think about what we're really trying to do here is to educate our students. And if you're a student and you don't get your financial aid, do you think you're going to stay? You think you're going to drop out? Do you think, I mean, it so undermines what we're all about that's job one. We have said on this dais any number of times that people want to come to Long Beach City College. One of our main goals is keeping them and getting them to complete. And if we set up these barriers, those things don't happen. I read an op-ed, I think last week, I think I shared it with Uduak from David Kerp from Berkeley about two little things that they did to help students stay in school. One was in financial aid stuff, they made sure that they got their money on time and on schedule, and that was very, very important. And one of the ways that they did that was to make sure that everybody was filling out their forms correctly, and they did that by making them shorter. You know, they explained, Mike and I talked about this too. And the other thing was that in acceptance letters, they made those shorter, but they told people that, congratulations, you got here. We're so proud to have you here, and encouraged them. And as a result of that, something like, I don't remember the exact numbers, but 20% more students enrolled than the previous year when they didn't take those affirming steps. So there's a whole toolkit of things that can be done, and we're just filling up our toolkit. And the things that I'm hearing here are the kinds of things that we've made decisions to do, we're implementing, and we're seeing results. So.
Thank you. So the cost of living adjustment is one of the primary assumptions we make when we're looking at our budget. This year I mentioned we have a 3.26% COLA. What's interesting is that when we have economic downturns and when we're in the recession, the state can choose not to fund the COLA. And they've done this recently, and they've not repaid us. And so we have to really exercise caution, and I think this goes to the conversation we had earlier about setting expectations for reserve levels. The intent of a reserve is to have sufficient reserves that allow you to weather up and downs in our revenue structure because of the economy. And I know that we've all been hearing about the bond markets and the they call it an inverted yield curve, but it's an indicator of an upcoming recession. UCLA's Anderson School of Business recently released their economic forecast. They're pretty good, although in this environment, no economic forecast is as good as it was 5 years ago. But they are anticipating eventual downturns. What's interesting about that to me is I've been saying that for about 3 years. We've had a record-setting economic growth period. But when we have a downturn, it hits hard in California. We typically lag recovery from the rest of the nation. The next slide I want to share with you does show the history of those COLAs. And specifically, when we look at fiscal year 2008-9, so that was the start of the last recession, and going through fiscal year 2012-13, you can see that there is a statutory COLA in each of those years. 10-11 actually had a negative one. That tells you something about the economy back then. But the state did not fund any of them. If the state were going to pay us back, they would actually have to give us a COLA greater than the statutory COLA. And you see that in 2001. So in that year, the state was repaying us for a previous withholding of COLA. And we don't see that pattern repeated at all. And in addition, when we are in a good economy, and you would think we would have sufficient state revenues to fund all community college districts, that is not true for 2018-19, as I'll discuss when I talk about the student-centered funding formula. So that is a great caution that I think downturns in the economy are a double-edged sword for us. Our enrollment tends to go up, but we will not likely receive the same funding per FTE as we do now. So when we look at what the state did do with their enacted 2019-20 budget, it was really interesting. The governor put a lot of money into paying down some liabilities and strengthening the state's rainy day fund. Part of that was specifically for the public school system, which is for K-14. When that account is fully funded, it will only be enough for 1 year of additional funding for us. The intent there is if we do have a year in which the state can't afford the COLA, that they would draw from this fund to ensure full funding. Those funds aren't projected to last for very long. But the state is also strengthening their own financial position. That includes with a substantial amount of money going directly to CalSTRS and CalPERS. The primary amount of that money that's going directly to those funds does not benefit us. A small piece, however, does benefit us. So when we look at the second major bullet here, and it is complicated, and I know it's complex, and I wish it weren't complex. The PERS rate is set annually by the board. The STRS rate is set in statute. And a couple of years ago, in 2013-14, the state recognized that both of those funds were upside down. And so they passed a law that said the STRS rate was going to increase by a certain amount each year, and that the PERS rate, the PERS board would take care of it. This year, they're dedicating additional fund to soften that increase. We still have an increase. It is just softened. And so you can see the STRS rate would have been increased from 16.11% to 18.1%. They've held the line at 17.1%. The PERS rate was expected to go up to 20.7, and now it's to 19.7. Those are still substantial increases over the prior year. And for 2021, again, we see a softening of that. And the reason I wanted to highlight that is that quite often when I see the budget summary that was put out by the administration or another analytical report, it'll say that they doesn't talk about softening and an increase, it'll say they reduced the rate, which is not exactly accurate.
Can I?
Absolutely.
But I think it's really important to note that in times of declining enrollments, and therefore theoretically, or not even theoretically, less money might become available, the rate at which we are expected to pay CalSTRS and CalPERS and STRS is still going from, I don't know whether we started at 8% and we're going to wind up at 20, 21 or 22%. They're trying to buy this down a little bit, but what it means is that we're going to wind up with a higher percentage of our monies going to pay those expenses. And the question is that sustainable, and how long is that going to go on, and what does that do to the education that we're trying to provide the students?
It's a very good point. I will have a slide that shows what those dollar amounts are, but I will say that for our full-time positions, we are at over a 40% benefits rate, due largely to STRS and PERS. That STRS and PERS are an actual percentage of that labor cost, a direct percentage, and it does reflect a significant diversion of revenues to support STRS and PERS. The COLA was applied to most categorical programs, which is good. It's difficult to manage those programs if they don't get the cost of living adjustment. Unfortunately, deferred maintenance was once again minimally funded. If you recall, last year in 2018-19, we originally anticipated that the state would give us about $2 million. By the time they finished with the enacted state budget, we only got about $400,000. And we dedicated all of that $400,000 to instructional equipment because the needs for instructional equipment were so great. And with our facilities renovations, we were able to do that. Unfortunately, this year we're getting even less. We are anticipated to only receive a little bit more than $200,000 for deferred maintenance / instructional equipment. And obviously at that level and with the size of our campus, that doesn't even come near to meeting our deferred maintenance needs. We did have good news. There is good news in this budget, and some of that great good news is that we did have 2 of our projects approved by the state. This is significant because there was a lot of back and forth during budget development at the state. As we all know, Governor Brown was not a supporter of the state bond program, and he slowed the release of those funds to all community colleges. And even though we had 2 programs that were in the queue, we had one that was approved, and so it takes several years to fund these. We have planning funds and then we have construction funds. But we had 2 projects that were in the queue and fully expected them to appear on the list of funded projects. And they weren't there at the May Revise. And then they weren't there at the versions of the budgets that went to both houses. Luckily, during conference committee, they reappeared. And that's important because and these 2 buildings are the construction trades phase 1 and the music theater complex, that's buildings G and H. The money's substantial. We are receiving $7 million for the construction phase 1, construction trades phase 1, $7 million. That means that frees up bond funds to use for another project. And then for building G and H, $17 million. And just a reminder, we are getting $27 million for buildings M and N. So it's significant, and we were incredibly pleased to see those projects placed back in the budget. So this is a very short summary of the unrestricted general fund. You did have attached to the agenda the more in-depth reflection of the unrestricted general fund. And then separately, you had provided for you each of the restricted funds, each of the other restricted funds, and we can go in those at a little bit more depth. But I highlighted the best news here, that in 2017-18, if you go back in time a little bit, the tentative budget reflected a $10.7 million deficit. The adopted budget was able to reduce it to $8.8 million. By the time we ended 2017-18, the deficit was just under $300,000. That was a phenomenal success. I can't take any credit for it. I joined the district that May, but it reflects a lot of hard work over the course of that year. Unfortunately, when I did come in and we were looking at 2018-19, we again saw the reappearance of an ongoing operational deficit. And what that means is we do have an ongoing operational deficit. We are not in balance with our budget.
Excuse me, Vice President, what do you attribute that to? The ongoing operational deficit, is that attributed to one factor over another?
STRS and PERS has a lot to do with it, President Malauulu. When we get to that slide, you'll see the dollar amount that we paid extra, and you'll see a correlation between that dollar amount and our deficit. When the STRS rate goes up by 3% in a year, that's equivalent to providing faculty with a 3% raise. It's exactly the same impact on our budget, so it is critical. And when we have salaries and benefits that hover around 90%, that's significant. And so, and then layering on top of that, that the STRS and PERS increases were more than the cost of living adjustment. It's automatically deficit spending. That when you combine our ongoing step and column increases, plus the STRS and PERS, you've already used up more than the COLA, your deficit spending. So we recognized that problem and we dealt with it head on. The first step was exactly what you mentioned, the SERP. The next step was to take a lot of actions to continue to reduce it. So I'm giving you the punchline before I tell you the full story. The punchline is that when we close this year, we have a surplus of nearly $6 million. Significant improvement. And for 1920, we have again a deficit projected of 2.9 million. Of that, 1 million is one time. So it's not an operational deficit. So our operational deficit is under 3 million for 2019-20. Yes, sir.
So, I turned it off. Slide 24 on the 5.9 million surplus we're talking about. So does that all go into the reserve, or does that get rolled over to, encumbered spending that didn't happen that could happen again the next year and is already allocated? What happens to that extra?
It all rolls into the ending balance. So in this case, our 18-19 ending balance is now $36.2 million, and that's where we start 19-20. So when we look at the 19-20 adopted budget, and we run the calculations, the state apportionment dollars, very easy to calculate since we're in hold harmless. We know pretty much what our federal revenues are going to be. The salaries and benefits reflect some additional faculty, but really just ongoing at the current levels as well as the other expenses. So what you see is the impact of that $36.2 million absorbing that projected deficit, with the remainder flowing through to the reserves. So the reserves now become 23.08% in 1920 because the reserves are enriched by the surplus in the prior year.
So what was that percent again?
It's a 23.08 for 1920.
Vice President Drinkwine. I'm sorry, Trustee Untuck, are you done? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just
I can come back.
following my eyes with the audio of where the number is. So thank you.
If you need me to come back, let me know. I have a question. So that $6 million reserve for 2018, 2019, will that be applied to offset the entire 2019-2020 budget, or just certain categorical portions of it, or how does that work? Does it impact the bottom line, or does it have to be used for specific areas?
So when we look at our unrestricted general fund, those dollars are the most flexible dollars. They're not open to any use, obviously. They have some restrictions. We have to use them to educate students or for things that benefit the education of the students.
Could they be used for salary?
Yes, they are used for salary. That is the primary use of these funds, is for salaries.
Could they be used for adjunct faculty office hours? So how would we budget that because I know we've talked about it, but we've been told that we can't, or we were told before that we couldn't. How about that? So because if contractually is that, if we have an existing bargaining agreement with our part-time faculty, can we take excess budget from one year and apply it to, because we have a contract. So how would that work?
I'll speak to that, and then VP Drinkwine and VP Durand, if you have anything different. You can spend your money on adjunct office hours if you decided to go there. You would do that as a part of the collective bargaining process with CHI, and if the board's pleasure was to offer that, it would be calculated in the cost that we presented to you as a total cost. And we would generally detail out what the various costs are, but it would be included in the cost that you would then approve as a contract in labor negotiations.
So, for example, hypothetically speaking, we have the $6 million that was remaining. If we were to use that money in 2019-2020, even though we've got the contract already with CHI, would we be able to disperse those funds this year and make it a one-time amendment to the existing contract, or would that be considered, I don't know if bonus is an appropriate word, but how would that work if we were to compensate adjuncts for if we were to give every adjunct, we have how many, 700 adjuncts?
Yes.
800?
So technically and by contract, every way that we pay an adjunct is under the contract and included in the contract. That would be my answer to you. I'm not sure if that answers your question. I think it's important that when we are working with a bargaining unit, that we honor the deal we have, and I hope I'm not overstepping, but respect the processes that we have for determining what that bargain is.
And I'm 100% in agreement. And I respect that. I completely agree. That's why I'm asking, how would we, when I asked Vice President Drinkwine if we could use it for salary and then if we could use it for adjunct hours, how could we do that in such a way that obviously we would not undermine the integrity of the collective bargaining process or the contract that's in place, but at the same time, we'd have to use them in 2019, 2020, right? Or we'd lose them, we wouldn't be able to apply them to a future contract?
I think what's important to remember is we currently are under negotiations with the adjunct faculty bargaining unit. Our next meeting will be on the 25th. We have not really received any proposals that have a great deal of fiscal impact. Usually those things are grouped together as far as what's offered to the other side, though we can talk about that at the table.
Yeah, can I make a quick point? And that is, if we try and take something that's negotiated and change it during the course of the year, then the message that we send to both sides is, we really don't have collective bargaining agreements. We just can change them every month or every 6 months or whenever we want to. And it undermines the integrity and the philosophy of collective bargaining. There are many, many, many community college districts that do not have collective bargaining at all. When we tried to put a collective bargaining session at the national ACCT meeting last year, what we were met with was, no, community colleges don't really do that much collective bargaining, so we don't want to do that. Fortunately, we were able to, because of our relationships, to say to Noah Brown, hey, enough of them do, and they need to know how to do it and how to do it right. And Long Beach City College was very involved in presenting the things that community colleges who do collectively bargain need to take into consideration, because in the end, all of this stuff is stylized to some extent. There are ways to do it, there are better ways to do it than other ways, and it can't just be, this is a good idea, let's fund it. And otherwise, I mean, we have trouble getting everything done every year that we want to do anyway, and so it's just like Marlene started off and said, here's the process, here's the way we go through it, here's what we come up with. That's a too long-winded way of saying that it's really important that we do what we say we're going to do, and we keep doing that. We can always make adjustments, but we make them at the appropriate times.
I concur, it's noted, I agree, I don't think that's, I understand negotiations with unions very well. So having said all that, yes, Dr. Amali, what can be done? What can we do? What creative way of utilizing that $6 million surplus where we could actually provide for one of the most underserved in terms of, payroll constituent groups on campus? Because the plight of adjuncts. I know it very well. Freeway flyers, they're teaching at we have adjunct faculty here on campus who teach at multiple colleges and have to patch together enough salary to make their house payment. They have to teach at 4 or 5 colleges. So if we've got $6 million, the first thing and I know that we could use that $6 million in multiple other areas of the district. I get that. But one of the things that we have been asking for, I have been asking for and I've been trying to get, is to have at least office hours for adjuncts, because adjuncts don't have that. And it turned out to be not cost effective, so I know we can't reopen the contract in the middle of a contract term, but what can we do?
I think that's very well said. I was an adjunct for 13 years, so I just love what you're saying. From a financial perspective, the $6 million, the fund balance is kind of like a checking account. So that's kind of your ending balance in your checking account at the end. It then rolls into the next year. So as it rolls into 1920, and we add the costs in 1920, it then leaves you with still a deficit at 3.5 million that includes the 6 million. Now, as you can see, we've been doing very well every year at chipping away at that and whittling away at that. But I think as the board considers its current, I believe, negotiations with CHI, that is absolutely something you can consider. If you think that it's important to you, by all means, you can tell each other and vote that in the contract that's something that is perhaps your number one priority as you negotiate with CHI.
President
And
Malauulu.
there are perhaps some things we can do in the meantime. Perhaps, you know, I don't know if, Jean, you have any ideas. Perhaps we hear from the adjuncts themselves, and maybe there's other non-cost ideas they might have that might be helpful.
President Malauulu, I was an hourly faculty member for 5 years, so I know what you're talking about. I hate to tell you, when I started, I got $8.98 an hour, and that was big pay in 1970. But anyway, I'm showing my age. I'm glad, President Romali, that you said that 6 million went. You know, it isn't like it's sitting here in the periphery and we can just take it off a tree. So I am concerned about that. What I would want to know, and maybe this isn't our business, but I was a freeway flyer. This was my income. But I wonder the percentage of people who are hourly, who this is, you know, they want to do it because they want to do it, and how much is their based on their need. I'd be very curious to hear what that percentage is. Is it 60-40? Is it 70-30? Because I have a feeling that people that I've talked to who teach hourly, and I know it's not everybody, so I mean, I shouldn't make broad-based statements, but there's a lot of people who just love teaching. They particularly maybe don't like their job. And so I love going to the classroom because it was wonderful. So I would be curious about that kind of a thing. But I agree with President Romali, you know, we have to whittle away at the deficit.
So are you saying we should ask the teachers to pay us for the privilege of
Yes,
teaching?
I am. I am.
Please strike Trustee Otto's comment from the record. Trustee Baxter, I completely agree. It actually cost me money to teach because I worked nights and I taught in the afternoon, and every time that I taught, I flopped, which is longshore terminology for I missed an opportunity to work. So I flopped twice a week every time I taught, and it cost me money. So longshore workers we don't have salary. We get paid when we work. If we don't work, we don't get paid. So my husband, when I was so excited to be teaching, because I love teaching and I wanted to be in the classroom, and I'd come home and he'd go, "You're making less money teaching than you would." He's like, "Don't teach and just go to work." But, you know, you're right. So I wasn't one of the freeway flyers. I didn't have to teach, but I'm very acutely aware of how many freeway flyers there are, and in fact, we had adjunct faculty demonstrations here on campus, actually. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that part-time faculty members teach under the same conditions that full-time faculty members do, but they're not afforded the same grace in terms of having office hours, and often some of the resources too. So just, you know, I would like to see something happen, and I think it would be great if we did bring in CHI at some point. But, you know, $6 million is not that much money when you're considering salary either. It's enough, it's a chunk of money, but it's not enough. So I get that. But anyway, I'm sure, Dr. Molly, did you want to add to that?
Yeah,
before
I
we
forgot
move?
something that I think you might enjoy. Last year, we did something quite special for the adjuncts, and we created adjunct workrooms in every department where we gave them office space and a coffee maker and supplies, and that really went a long way in computers and printers. So any little thing that we can do to make them feel comfortable and welcome here, we're open to any suggestions that come our way.
And that was a huge hit, by the way. That was a huge hit. Yes, Trustee Untuck.
Just on the topic of reserves, I know last year we discussed it, but didn't necessarily take action on creating a rainy day fund. And it seems like right now is the right time that we have funds available. We could put in a rainy day fund. And it might be interesting to reevaluate, should we put our board policy at the recommended level that the curriculum folks recommended 9.5%, and above and beyond that, we put into a rainy day fund that we can actually say, point to of, we're also offsetting potential, or it's clear to see what's in the bank above and beyond our risk tolerance. So I don't know what people's thoughts are.
Absolutely outstanding idea. We could certainly do it with this budget. It also, when I spoke to CEOs around the state of the STRS and PERS increases, they said, oh, we're really not hit by it because we're using our rainy day fund. Hey, you guys should think about that rainy day fund. So we could absolutely do that with this adopted budget. I think it's a wonderful idea that you brought up.
And I guess the question I had too was, I think the state created it 3 years ago or 4 years ago. And I don't know, I know it was under the Brown administration, but I don't know, like, how often do they put into it? How do they reassess it every year? What is the criteria they use it? You know, say we have a recession, does that mean we're going to get a 1% COLA from the state rainy day fund and that offsets? Or
So the answer to the first statement, I wanted to point out that these are what we call one-time dollars. That because they are savings from 1 year, you can only use them once, unlike an ongoing dollar, and dedicating them to something like a rainy day fund is an excellent idea. On the issue of pay, we can only pay what we have as board approved, or it's a gift of public funds, and so that's why it is important to have collective, the bargaining process. There was another statement that, did we have to use it or lose it? The state's unrestricted funding model, unlike the federal funds, we can choose not to spend them in the year they're generated. There is a balance between wanting to spend money on students that generated the fund versus really getting to a really safe and secure reserve level, so there is that. But then, and finally, your question about the rainy day fund. The state created it anticipating that at some point they're going to have not excess revenues, but revenues are going to be greater than what the demand is. And so they would take a piece of that and deposit it into the rainy day fund. They were not able to do that for the first 3 years, I believe, after they created it. It also had a couple of really interesting things for the K-12 world. Once they did that, then the K-12 world had to not exceed their minimum reserve requirement. That requirement was not applicable to us at the community college level. But this is the first year that they have a deposit. It is the first year they have the deposit. It's a big deal that they're making the deposit into the rainy day fund. And the question of whether it would be sufficient to fund what portion of our need depends entirely on when we have that need and how many deposits they've made between now and when we have that need. But at maximum, they don't believe that it would last any more than 1 year. But the they in that quest statement is economists who are looking forward and looking at what could be the potential need and what could this fund grow to. But it is a unique concept and it is a new concept. But you can choose to establish either a committed reserve or a set aside for a specific purpose, and that is up to your discretion.
I think that's a great idea, and I know we can't make any motions here because it is a study session, but is that something that we could direct when we come back for the September budget to have the implementation? Are you good with that, Trustee Antak, Trustee Otto?
Sorry, what did you suggest?
To have staff come back at the September budget meeting with a rainy day line item in the budget.
As an action item?
No. This is what I said was we can't really have an action item because this is a study session, but we can direct staff to come back in September and implement that as a line item in the budget when we adopt the budget. Trustee Baxter, you guys all okay with that?
I'd love to see a report.
You want a report or you want to just be a line item in the budget?
I'm not ready to say that that's the right way to spend that money until I look at it in context. And I keep looking at this thing here and see that, yeah, we've got $6 million, but at the end of next year we'll be 3.5 million underwater. And so it's not one-time money. it's part of an ongoing budgeting process. And so I think the correct questions to ask are, how do we be fiscally responsible and accomplish the things that our goals tell us we should be doing? And rainy day fund could be part of that, but you have to ask it in the context of the big picture of how we carry out our mission, how we do the things we're supposed to do.
Sure. No, I do understand that, and I agree with you. I just want to know if there's any objection to having that, because the rainy day fund could be zero forever, but when we do have a surplus, that it would be allocated to that, so we'll have it. Because right now, our budget doesn't have a rainy day line item.
What we could do, if it pleasures the board, we could create the line item at zero for the adopted budget, bring back a report, and then perhaps during the discussion of the budget, then you determine if you want to fund it, and if so, how much. Sure. Would that be pleasurable?
Sure.
And
I agree with Trustee Otto that I think it needs more study, but I'm not objecting to a zero balance on that line item.
Yeah, I don't object either, but I also agree of the policymaking process should be information requests, look at some of our options, figure out which policy does it actually line up in, make sure we know our options, and then put something up for a vote. I think that's the right way to go about it.
And if I may, the establishment of that fund does not need to happen prior to your adoption of the budget. Since the budget is a living document, you can choose to take that action at some point in the future and establish it then, and then at that point, move whatever portion of the reserves you'd like to do into that fund, so you can have, it doesn't happen to be, or it doesn't have to be rather at the September meeting. It could be at some point in the future.
Okay, I think we're all in agreement that a rainy day fund is a good idea, and to have staff come back with a report with information for us to consider, pros and cons and how it would work, and then to have the September budget have a line item at zero, and then we can determine where to go from there once we have information and opportunity for discussion. Okay, sounds good. Everybody in agreement? Yeah. All right, I know we can't vote, but, thank you. All right. Vice President Drinkwine, I know you're eager to continue.
Thank you so much. I want to talk next about the specifics in our deficit reduction plan, because after talking about that big swing, I want to be able to show you exactly how we got there. So you have an additional handout called the Deficit Plan Update. And in that document, I talk about the different methods that we use to achieve savings, and it was very, very purposeful. What I'd like to do is bring up the waterfall chart that's associated with that handout, because I think it really illustrates those different actions. All right, and so the chart is behind you, but it's also within your handouts. And so if I could direct you to the last page of the deficit reduction plan, and there we go, now it's on the screen. This chart shows the deficit starting with a tentative budget of $6 million. The deficit is reflected in the yellow bars. Any positive improvements to the deficit are in the green. So the green means more money, that we have saved money. The red means that costs us a little bit more. So when we walk through this chart and we start at the far left, our deficit was $6 million. And so you can see that that goes down to the negative $6 million mark. It goes below that center line. So know that the center of this chart is your zero. The first thing we did was save $3 million through the SERP and the hiring of adjunct. $3 million out the door. The next thing we did, significant because it was necessary, not significant because of the dollar amount, were the best practices that we put into place related to travel, hospitality, and supplies. And you can see when I get to the end that it was great that those saved us those little bumps at the beginning. We saved some big dollars near the end of this process. We also looked at our contracts and paid a lot of attention to the contracts. So the first swipe of the deficit, we were able to reduce it to about $3 million. So you can see that, and that's labeled adopted budget deficit. It's the second yellow bar. Then again, right out the bat, we did some more reorganization. That the SERP retirees weren't just faculty, it represented management as well as classified. And we took the opportunity with each vacancy to take a hard look at our structure in each work unit and say, is this how it should be organized? Is this the position as it should be? Many of these positions had been held by our folks for a couple of decades. People love working for Long Beach City College, but that means we didn't have an opportunity to revisit them. And so every opportunity we took, we looked at what are we trying to do? Is it the same thing as what we did before? And what are the different tools we use now? So we spent money on systems. Financial aid is a really good example. We spent money on systems and financial aid, but we spent money across the board on systems to help support a leaner and more efficient workforce. Then we get to the first quarter, and we still had some improvement at the first quarter. So now at the first quarter, it's about, I believe it was about $400,000. And then again, we had more improvements. So we really wanted to capture all the savings as we went along. And then if we fast forward to this last quarter. So this reflects closing year. So when we closed the year, I certainly didn't anticipate such a swing, but we made incredible strides, particularly in contract services. We had a huge amount of savings there. We always have savings there because you typically don't use up your entire contract, but we had far more than we thought we were going to have. We did an in-depth review of every single contract we have in this district to see if we still needed it, and if we did, if that was the right vendor to use. We had savings from our BPRs. It was not purposeful. We couldn't implement everything we wanted to implement in 1 year, so we had a rollover. So I will say that not all the savings were purposeful. We didn't put into systems what we expected to put because it took us longer to identify what systems we were purchasing, so we expect to see more in the next year. But overall, I think this tells you the story that we took very deliberate, very purposeful actions over the course of the year to get to savings. And a lot of the reorganization, beyond the very first one, which were largely one time, those represent ongoing savings. Some of it is we didn't fill the positions yet, but we did a significant work with reorganization, and that continues forward. So when we look at what we're going to do next, we're continuing to implement systems. We're going to continue to do reorganization, but we are also looking at other areas. One is we're looking at implementing a position control system. Position control is used to control the budgeting for your vacancies. Right now, we do not have a system. It's really unusual for an organization of our size not to have position control. It essentially gives every position a number. You can't hire it unless you have budget. It controls it. The second is we're looking at efficiency measures in academic affairs. And when I say we, I'm really saying Dr. Scott's looking at efficiency measures along with her entire team. And I would like Dr. Scott, if I may, to explain a little bit more about her efforts there and what we can expect to achieve as savings moving forward.
Thank you. Yes, we look at various efficiency measures for our scheduling. The three that we look at primarily are fill rate and FTES over FTEF, that ratio, and also average class size. And we have goals for the first two of those, fill rate and the ratio. We are not where we need to be quite yet, but it's important to look back and see what has happened over the last few years. Prior to me arriving here, we adhered very strictly to the contract and administration at that time, and canceled a lot of classes, because the contract says anything 20 or under is potentially could be canceled. And we canceled a lot of those classes. This was before the entire team was here. And that had a really adverse impact on our students, on our faculty, and on our community. And when I got here, I heard about it a lot. And so we opted to go a different route. And that does have an impact on the budget when you're allowing classes to go that are at 16 or 17, and we did that because we really needed to rebuild our enrollment and we needed to rebuild our reputation, frankly. So that's one, it's not an excuse, but it's the reality of what happened. So we've been allowing, as we're trying to grow back and grow programs, we've been allowing things to go perhaps a little bit lower than than we had previously. We haven't lost ground on efficiency, but we have not gained. So I do recognize that we have a budget issue with this and that we have to look at it, but it's a balance. And as we go forward, and as you may recall, we implemented the large classes and allowed stipends to be paid to faculty who reached a certain level. We worked with the FA and Mr. Durand on this, so that the way the large classes worked is if faculty didn't get another 23 or whatever it was students, they got nothing. So if they got to 22, they got no compensation for taking those extra 22 students. So we did implement the new process for large classes, to give stipends in the intermittent steps, which I think has also encouraged faculty to be in a position to add more students. So as we look at a time now, like this fall, where we are up, and we're not struggling continually for enrollment, we need to bring this back in and talk to the faculty again about efficiency and the importance of it, because efficiency does a number of things. It shows that we're using our resources wisely as possible, and it also provides for the greatest access for students, because if you've only got 15 students in a class, what classes are you not adding that students really need where there's wait lists? So it's incumbent on us to make sure that we're doing everything we can to ensure that students get the classes they need. And that's not always a popular decision, and it is a required balance. And I work with the deans, and sometimes we just agonize over these classes that are at 13 or 14, and we have to look, are they capstone classes? Have we not offered that class for 2 or 3 semesters and students have been waiting for it? We need to look at that. And we've also been talking within enrollment management about creating a guaranteed schedule of classes that we absolutely will offer every 2 years, no matter what, even if there's 1 student in there, so that they can be assured that they can finish that program. So we're looking at a lot of these things, but we know that we have efficiency issues that we have to deal with. We do recognize we have budget considerations within academic affairs also.
Can I ask you a question about, there's something that I don't understand, and I'm sure there's a good explanation for it. When you say that $1 million of the deficit is the result of the use of one-time funds designated for business process reviews, it was my understanding that those monies were designated for that, but you can borrow from that. Is that what happened? And I just don't. And I looked at the business process reviews update that's with us. I don't know. Understand how that works.
So we, in a previous year, in our unrestricted general fund, received several $1 million from the state to pay down their debt to us for mandated cost claims. They gave it to us as unrestricted dollars, but it really reduced their debt. So we got a big chunk of money, and it's sitting in the sitting in the unrestricted general fund. And the decision was made then that we were going to use that pot of money to support system implementation, because that can be expensive and it's hard to find the money. And that money's been used every year gradually. So when we use that money, it's like using your savings, which looks like deficit spending because you're spending money you didn't receive that year. We received it a previous year. But it's one-time money. So there's a very distinct difference between one-time money. We got it one time, and once we spend it, it's gone. It's not coming back. Versus ongoing money, which represents what the state gives us every year on a regular basis. And so that's what that is. And so when we look at that, a little bit more, about $3.5 million deficit in the 2019-20 year. 1 million of it is budgeted for BPRs and coming from what's left of that pot of money. So really what we have as an ongoing problem is 2.5 million. If I were coming to you and saying that our deficit spending was just $1 million and it's because we're spending one-time monies, that's not a negative thing. It's money we saved from a previous year for a specific purpose, and now we're doing it. Another example could be, for instance, if we didn't have a bond program and we knew we had to put a new roof on a building. So we would set aside money every year for that, and then the year we use it, that's not a bad thing, but it does represent deficit spending. And that's what these BPRs are.
I guess and I understand it better now, but It was always my understanding that the business process review money, I think it started off at pretty close to $6 million. And we had a program as to what we were going to do and how we were going to spend it. It started off with design thinking, and there were, I never thought we really embraced that completely, or as much as we should in order to make that successful. But I see that we're going to spend quite a bit of money next year, but I didn't know whether we're putting money back into it to do that, or whether it's still there. It's just an accounting question, I suppose.
We are using the same pot of money that was there. We have not augmented that pot of money for the BPRs in any way, shape, or form. I will say that not all system implementations comes from that pot of money. So for this example, if we have a department that is largely funded by a restricted program, whether it's a grant or a categorical program, it could be appropriate to use that restricted source of funding to pay for that system. And we try and use our restricted dollars first, because they have very few expenditures. If we can use it there, we do, because it allows us to have more flexibility. But we've done that as well too. Part of the deficit reduction plan is leveraging those restricted dollars, and I can say you can see a lot of examples in student support services that we've really dedicated the use of those restricted resources in a very thoughtful manner to make sure that we're getting the most bang for our buck out of them.
Okay, great, thanks.
A couple of examples of that Mike did a wonderful job implementing was the QLIS system, which has taken our lines from 3 hours down to about 10, 15 minutes. You get like a beeper in your restaurant. You get beeped and it says you're up in 15 minutes, and they can come from home, so they don't have to stand in a 3-hour line. The other one is the implementation of Campus Logic, which has taken the packaging of financial aid from 30 days down to approximately 3 days. So those are just a couple examples.
We've also implemented NailNet, which allowed our students for the first time this past year to make payments on their fees. And so that was a really critical area as well. So system implementation is a tremendous amount of work. We have an incredible IITS team that works very closely with each of the departments to make sure that we're meeting their needs. But as busy as this past year was, I can say that next year is going to be even busier with system implementation. Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Vice President Drinkwine, thank you so much for this great data visualization. I know we talked about it 9 months ago about trying to put things in a way that's easy to see all the different steps and what takes us from, and that was a question that I think I heard a lot last year of, oh, we always say we have this deficit and then we don't have a deficit. What happened? Where did the money go? It's all magic. And so it's good to see it itemized in colors, and this is a good process. And I hope this is something we can put in our regular budget slides when we do our quarterly reports or our semi-annual, so that people can see the difference. I just a couple questions on the red. It goes up, but it's red. Is that good or bad? There wasn't a legend on it. I wasn't sure what the reds meant.
The red is actually an increase in expenditures. I did not want to misrepresent the course of our budget. There are areas that we increased expenditures. Very interestingly, between the second and third quarter, we actually had an increase in our staffing. So our approach starting this year is to have our budget updated quarterly to reflect where we actually think we're going to end up. We are not holding on to these savings and squirreling them away for the end of the year where they magically appear. It's really important to be transparent and to share as we have improvements. And because of that, when we have a negative, when we had an increase in expenditure over where we thought, that's also reflected. And so after the second quarter, we projected savings, because at that time you have half the year gone, and you can look at your salaries. You can say, well, I've budgeted for the whole year. Let me capture the savings for that now. We captured a little bit too much savings, and so we had to increase the budget a little bit. Another area was contract services. We had reduced the budget in contract services too much. We needed to put a little bit more back in. And that's what that reflects. And I will also say thank you very much, Trustee Udawak. This was your request for a waterfall chart. So those of you who aren't into charts like I am, this is a waterfall chart, and it's really a great tool to use to show the progression of our budget. So thank you.
And a few other questions. I like the sound of the business improvement or the BPRs, but I've never seen an itemized list of, so we spent 6 million, we're down to 1 million. Which programs did we spend it on, and what was the result? Is it in there? And I'm missing it? Oh, all right. I didn't read the special.
We actually have it as a separate item.
Okay.
It does affect the budget. It is related to the budget, but I wanted to have this as a separate item so that we can distinctly say, here is the status of these. I will also say that when we first received those one-time funds, and there was a general agreement to use them for BPRs, the needs back then are not the needs today. So this list has definitely evolved in a major way. And right now we are focusing on making sure that all of our systems are integrated. We're looking at trying to reduce the number of new systems that we bring in. IITS has released the Viking portal, which gives us single sign-on options, which is great, which means you have to remember your username and password for 10 different software packages. So we are recognizing that there are additional challenges to having system implementation at this level, but we believe we are managing it well, and I have to give a shout out to Sylvia Lynch and her team. They are phenomenal.
Last two questions. On the position control system, when do we plan to get a system, and what will it be? Is it?
So position control systems, because it hits every position and because it hits our budget, are very complicated systems. We have PeopleSoft as our financial system. I know PeopleSoft has a position control module. If we made a decision tomorrow, we couldn't start implementation until next year. We have to make sure that the data is very clean before we rolled over. Simultaneously, the LA County Office of Education is implementing their new financial system, and they serve over 500 agencies countywide. We are what they call we are not integrated into their system. We run our own payroll, but they do issue our commercial warrants. So we have a connection to their system, and we need to get through that process before we can layer this on top. So the plan is this year, we investigate. We're going to look at different systems, PeopleSoft first because it's already there, but what other systems are out there, determine how that meets our need, and then have a very thoughtful implementation process because this is a big deal. My desire, the soonest we could do it if we moved super fast, would be next year. Most likely it would be the year after.
Great. And then for Dr. Scott, on the academic affairs, kind of key metrics and efficiencies, would we be able to see those twice a year after the end of each semester, what the fill rate and what our tactics we used to make sure we increased enrollment? Because maybe I missed the document. I don't remember seeing fill rates and ratios before, and I think it's a great information to share and understand how we're doing.
Sure. We have 3-year metrics, and the slide was up at College Day, but it went really fast because I was a little bit behind schedule. But we do have 3-year metrics, and 2 of them have efficiency in there. And so we are going to continue to look at it. No, it's critically important because it's a big budget item. The salaries of faculty and adjunct faculty, it's big. So yeah, we will continue to report on it. For example, our fill rate our goal is 85%, which may be a little low. We're about 83% right now. Our average class size is about 29.5. Our goal is about 33. But we have a lot of CTE programs which have lower sizes, and we've opted to do that as an institution, but it comes at a cost because the courses that are the most efficient are the survey courses. But when you have a lot of CTE programs, nursing, and it isn't going to be like that.
We could always look at it as a
It's a
true
balance.
ratio and then take the
It's a
CTE
balance.
classes out and see how those
Yeah.
non-CTE classes.
Well, and I'm hoping with the large classes that we've put in, that will help, because if you have a class, a survey class of 80 students, and then it kind of balances out the CTE class that may be at 18 or whatever. So and that hasn't really fully got going, so I'm hoping that people will start to understand that that's really actually a good strategy.
And the large classes are kind of the GE, English 1, English 3?
Not
Or is it-
English, because there's a big writing component, and we don't consider that really a survey class.
I guess what falls
The
into
lecture, it's typically the lecture classes.
history?
It's history, poli-sci, political science.
Low importance.
Or that's the same thing, actually. Sociology, psych. Yeah, it's the typical lecture classes. And I didn't mention before when I was talking that in regards
I'm
to
just joking.
sorry.
Good.
In regards to PCC, we're also trying to make sure that we don't cancel too many classes out there, because there's a greater ratio of canceled classes at PCC. And so that's another issue with the 20 and canceling, is that we really have to support that campus.
Thank you.
Vice President Scott, couple things. First of all, my classes were never in danger of being canceled. They were always full. And I just feel it's important for me to just get that out there, that as soon as the schedule for enrollment for registration was released, my classes were full. I feel better now having said that. About PeopleSoft, so I was teaching here when we transitioned to PeopleSoft, and while it is better than the system we had before, because it is, and the system we had before was this might be a new word, but dinosauric. It's just I don't even want to say prehistoric, it was just dinosauric. PeopleSoft is better. Now, today, I registered my son for classes, and I was, the only reason why I was able to successfully navigate PeopleSoft, and I did, was because I had been on PeopleSoft before as an instructor. So if I had not had the experience of having used it as an instructor, I probably would have kicked the computer and thrown it out the window, because it is not intuitive. It is not, it is user-friendly in the sense where, you can figure out what click and you can go back, but it's just not an intuitive process. So definitely PeopleSoft. And then the other one that I just want to mention is Campus Logic. Where does Campus Logic fit into your waterfall presentation? Because I have not heard one good thing about Campus Logic. And maybe there are good things, but I just haven't heard them. What I keep hearing is that Campus Logic moves students into queues, and they sit there and they need to be verified, or it's almost like work is done twice. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but please respond to that, because that's the feedback that we're getting. And if you could explain for the public what Campus Logic is.
Sure. So Campus Logic is essentially a technology platform that allows students to move through the student verification process electronically. So think about it in two stages. There's the student interface piece, and then there's kind of what happens behind the scenes as staff move through and verify. Now, one of the things I want to say, and in the spirit of transparency, is whenever you're implementing new technologies, there's always going to be bugs. There's always going to be transition. So is it a magic bullet that solves all our problems? No. But what I can tell you, when we look at our numbers, and I want to give you some numbers that I just got from financial aid today. So just to give you some context, last year, and I'm going to just estimate, we had about 10,000, a little over 10,000 students unduplicated receive Pell. This year, and we're only on day 2, we're at 9,000 for the entire, so you think 10,000 from last school year, 9,000 on the second day of school, so, and some change. So those are huge you know what I'm trying to say, leaps. And so they're big leaps. And so essentially, the technology is what's allowing that to happen. Because what's happening is students now don't have to stand in a long line. A lot of students about roughly over 30% are selected for verification. Many of them will see that line or see all the papers they have to print out from the PeopleSoft or from the website and I don't want to do this. This is too much work. I'll just keep my BOG fee waiver and never complete my Pell. And so now they can take pictures of their parents' taxes, they can hand their phone and their parent can sign with their fingertips so they don't have to get an actual signature, upload, and never even step foot in the financial aid office. Now, on the back end, there are some issues that staff have brought forward to my attention as well as the director, where, and I'll give you a case in point, the technology is sensitive. And what I mean by that is, let's say I'm selected for verification, I upload all my forms, a staff member goes through and updates and verifies everything's there and completes the package. Let's say a student goes in and updates their phone number. It makes us go back and have to check because you don't know exactly what feature it updates. So there are feeling like things that wouldn't trigger another review, like an updating of an address or a phone number, is triggering in this software because these are federal documents and you want to be very audit proof in the way you set things up. Any kind of change a student makes in the system triggers another secondary review of the file. So that's some of the things that we're working, and just so you know, we are being very responsive. I directed our dean to reach out to the vendor and have a conversation specifically with the vendor and saying some of these things like an updated cell phone that are triggering a secondary review, can we take that off so it's not so sensitive to these triggers? So like I said, it's new technology, we're working through it. But in mass, like when we're seeing in mass, this is amazing what it's doing. Another point, and I'm going to use this story because I think it's an education standpoint. I had a student I was walking with today out in the front. He tells me, I hate QLIS. And I said, oh, okay. I said, why do you hate it? He's like, because I have to wait 3 hours. And I said, oh, okay. I said, you know, last year, the lines were about, the reason we got QLIS were 3 to 4 to 5 hour waits in financial aid. And, but the difference was you had to stand in a physical line in the sun. Students, and I said, you know, QLIS doesn't necessarily reduce the wait times. What it does is it means that you can go do other things for 3 hours. You can sit in the library, you can go watch TV in the student lounge, you can go do your shopping at Whole Foods up the street, and then come back and walk right into the office and not have to be physically in a line. So these technologies are not going to solve all our problems, but they're definitely dealing with some of the issues that we've had that have made the student experience not as great as it should be in the past.
Absolutely, and I don't mean to be critical of the technology. I'm in favor of the technology, and I know that students really appreciate that. So I don't want you to think that the criticisms that I have heard are exactly what you just described, that it causes staff to have to redo something twice, but it could be resolved with the vendor perhaps sending out, when the student changes the phone number and it gets back into the queue, maybe have something say, just the phone number. That way you go directly to that and you're not reviewing the entire application. Or if the student updates 2 items, you can, you know, it'll flag those 2 items. But, and also, Dr. Scott, the actual enrollment process today was good. I don't want you to think that it wasn't. So it didn't take me very long. I actually was able to do it in about 10 minutes. And that was a lot of forms and a lot of registration. And then yesterday when I went through the enrollment, now that's different because that has changed a lot. And it's very efficient and you've streamlined the process. So as a parent enrolling a student who is a minor, it was a really good process. I can say that. But I think I would have struggled with PeopleSoft. I don't think I would have struggled with the actual, what is the initial portal? The very first thing I did yesterday, what is that called?
ECC Apply?
Yeah, I don't think I would have struggled with that. That was really intuitive, but I think if I hadn't used PeopleSoft before, I definitely would have struggled today. So that was just, you know, keep that in mind.
Appreciate the feedback, and one of the things that we will be doing over the next several months is, especially after the PeopleSoft upgrade that's going to be happening, is looking at the student user experience, also trying to put as many of our functions that require students to stand in long lines and admissions and records, to move as many of those functions to self-service will also be something that we want to be able to work towards. So I know that Marlene has been very supportive. Our VP Drinkwine has been very supportive of us once we get through the PeopleSoft upgrade to start to have those conversations about what can we do around enhancements to increase the student experience.
Can I make one cultural point, and that is, you know, I think we got PeopleSoft so long ago and made the commitment to PeopleSoft. And periodically it comes up, why don't we change PeopleSoft? And the answer is because it would be prohibitively expensive and we're not sure what we would wind up with. And we'd have to break everything in. So when we started this business processes review thing, the decision was made to work with PeopleSoft to do all this stuff. And and I believe that instead of going a way that they might have gone, which would have been very complicated and maybe not very successful, they said, we're going to just keep fine-tuning PeopleSoft. We're going to keep working with PeopleSoft to do this. And there's a price that you pay for that, but there's also rewards that you get from that. And it boggles the mind to think what we would do to yank everything out and start something else. When the idea of business process review came in, the sexy part of it was it's business processes from the student perspective. It's how are they experiencing what's going on here. And we had people come in and talk to us about it. Now, there were a lot of faculty that didn't like it and were very, very vocal about that and thought it was money that was not well spent. And I think we've actually moved away to a certain extent from that, for better or for worse. And we've, as you'll see, we've got, we're planning to spend $2.5 million this year on trying to do some other things. But it's always a series of choices. I mean, when I came on this board a long time ago, our big problem was that we couldn't get data from Long Beach Unified. And that was because we didn't know how to get it. They didn't know how to give it to us. And now that's done. And that enables us to do all kinds of things that, it made things possible that made our educational experiences better and gave us more data and all that. That happens every year. There's something new that we get that we keep improving. We just want to keep our heads down and make sure we're making good decisions. And I really like the way that Mike is approaching this and saying, okay, let's try this. Let's figure it out. If there's a problem, let's see how we can do this, because it'll make us serve our students better if we do these things. And if you have to go back to the vendors or whatever. And I'm, and especially looking at this business process review stuff, am concerned that what we're trying to do is really ambitious this next year, and I don't know if we've got the bandwidth to accomplish all that. And I don't know what the fallback plans are if we don't, and it gets to go off on to next year. Or when we get to that part of the discussion, we can do it. But it's all good that we're trying these things and that we're trying to get them. One's a question of what should we do. The next question, of course, is how are we doing it, and is it successful? Yeah. How about those surplus funds?
Okay, we're going to return back to the presentation. I think you'll find we'll go a little bit faster from this point, especially once we get past the student-centered funding formula portion. I want to talk a little bit more about the specific expenditures, specific revenues. You can see that the primary source of our unrestricted revenues is the state principal apportionment, primarily the student-centered funding formula. That when we look at that, we are getting a $4 million increase this year for the COLA. When we talk about expenditures in a moment, you'll see that a large portion of that is used to support STRS and PERS. So when we look at the student-centered funding formula, we're still only in, this is year 2. 2019-20 is year 2 of the student-centered funding formula. And it's really changed dramatically the entire structure of revenue for us moving forward, that we have our base allocation, very similar to how we were funded before, but now we get a pot of money based on the number of students who we can identify as low income, and it's really only in specific ways that we can identify them as low income. We don't get to just say, are you low income? At the K-12 level, for instance, they do this with the free and reduced price meal applications. They use that to establish low income. Here, our only opportunities are through eligibility for Pell Grants or other formal identifications. So our ability to get students to actually go through that process. It's not just about how many students do we have that we know of. We have to get them to go through that process to be identified. And then for the student success allocation, those are the completion rates primarily. And what we found was that 18-19 was a year of lessons for the chancellor's office. I mentioned before that they were unprepared with their revenue projections to fully fund districts at the level that districts performed. They told us, this is how you're going to get funded now. Complete students, identify low-income students, enroll them. And what we did is we completed students and we identified them as low income, and statewide it broke the bank. Statewide, there are only 26 districts at the hold harmless level, meaning that under the new formula they would get less money. We're one of 26. The remaining 45 are above the hold harmless level. And the chancellor's office, when they realized they didn't have enough money, put it all on the backs of those districts above the hold harmless level. They were limited to an 8% increase. They're not happy with us, the rest of those community colleges, because we were protected. We didn't have any piece of the reduction in funding. Only those districts that are above the hold harmless, and they were all limited to an 8% increase. But I think that signifies that the chancellor's office was committed to that promise to fund all community college districts no lower than the hold harmless, which is the 2017-18 level increased by COLA.
We were in the 26 or the 45 bucket?
We're in the 26. We're in the 26, meaning that when we calculate our revenues using just the student-centered funding formula, we would lose about $2 million. That's in addition to the $1.3 million we would lose for not being in a large college. So if we didn't have hold harmless, we would be funded at a level that's about $3.5 million less than we are.
So when it initially was introduced in year one, I think we had a projected $10 million deficit. So does that say that we're doing, 4 times better almost, or 5 times better?
When it was introduced, we were anticipated to lose approximately 10.7. We lobbied very, very hard for changes in the formula, along with several other CEOs statewide. There have been a number of changes implemented as a result of not only our lobbying, but some of that other lobbying. So the reduction is less. Yes.
One of the primary changes was the ongoing COLA. The initial proposal just said hold harmless at that level, no increases for COLA. A following amendment to the formula allowed us to get COLA in each year, and it increases our hold harmless. So that was critical, because otherwise we had stagnant funding and wouldn't be able to afford any increase.
We also lost a potential amount of money. We increased approximately 29-30% this year in terms of graduation, but because everybody did so well, we're not paid at it. They capped it either 8 or 10% now.
Right. So as a result, they implemented some changes to the formula so that they could just restrict our ability to increase. And it was all done at the student success allocation. The first thing they did is they said, okay, I know that you can have a student who gets an associate's degree and a certificate. We're only going to fund the highest earning award, just one award per student per year. If you had a student whose subsequent years gets completion, you can fund that. But in 1 year, only the highest award. The second thing they did was they look at the transfers. So the highest earning completion was an associate's degree with transfer. So yay, And I know that my 21-year-old son has taken classes here and has taken classes at Cerritos. So when he transfers, we would have both gotten credit for that. Mm-hmm. And they said, no. They're closing that loophole. To get credit for a student who transfers, that student will have had to complete at least 12 units in your district, and they would have to have done that the year prior to the transfer. So if you have a student who's attending a lot, potentially they could generate the transfer for both community colleges, but it's unlikely. They also looked at ways to cap the overall growth. Right now, they are basing it on a 3-year average, so you can't spike 5-year formula. I would anticipate there's going to be continued significant reform, but because of the level of these reforms they've made, they gave us an additional year in hold harmless. The hold harmless period was intended to allow us to transition to the new formula. These are significant changes. They've really changed the rules of the game, so we have an extra year.
And it just happened almost moments ago after we'd already achieved the completion growth. So it was discouraging, but that's not going to stop us from completing students.
And I think that says something about the rulemaking, that with the May revise, the chancellor's office had their proposals. They didn't have a lot of transparency about the proposals when they came out. And they continue to evolve. They continued to evolve until the budget that was presented to both houses. They continued to evolve through the conference committee. And it wasn't until after it was passed and we saw the trailer legislation, because it's contained in the trailer legislation, that we knew where we ended up.
I guess my question of the things that we did to change, to try to adapt to the rules as they were given to us in the first place, how do we measure up ourselves to, if we didn't get capped and if they didn't
We definitely, and when I say we, I mean collectively came together and determined this is where we have to end up when we exit hold harmless to not lose funding. What's feasible to increase in each year? And I think we had some really aggressive goals, and I think with some of them we exceeded our expectations and other ones we didn't, and I think that was to be expected in the first year, that as we look back we did some things great, other things didn't move as quickly as we wanted them. For instance, Dr. Munoz can talk about the increase in Pell Grant identifications, that as a revenue generating stream, identifying students as low income benefits us both on the low income portion, but also with student success, because those completions get a bump up for those students.
And can I say one other thing about it, and that is, I think what everybody realizes is that the student-centered funding formula is really complicated. And if it's complicated, it creates incentives to game it. And everybody is figuring out how to get to where they need to get to in order to get the maximum amount of money that they possibly can. And it creates what I call disingenuous behavior. If what you're trying to do is just do it, but you're not really doing it, but you found a way to do it, if it was simpler, it would be easier. But having gone this way, and performance funding is kind of this way, there's no question it's broken. The real question is, can it be fixed? And I'm not sure.
So one of the things that we spent a lot of time doing on the first year in student services is looking at the student-centered funding formula and identifying those opportunities to set really concrete goals that would help generate and increase the funding. So we set a goal to increase 20% awards in Pell. So for example, when we look at the BOG fee waiver number and we look at the Pell fee waiver number, essentially, well, it's now the California Promise, but there's little under 20,000 students getting the California BOG, and there's about 10,000 students getting the Pell. You would want to see closer parity between those two numbers. And so we're really targeting those students, and we saw that so many students were not completing the verification process, hence why we brought Campus Logic in, right? And so really monitoring those numbers. And so last year, we only had a very modest increase of about 2% in Pell identification. But that was in part because we were coming out of the cyber attack and much of those things had to be rebuilt. And so we're on track this year, as I mentioned in the early indications, that we're gonna have a banner year in financial aid. We expect to hit or exceed that 20% because we're being very diligent. So it's what I call key performance indicators. So we have a key performance indicator for direct high school matriculation, which we saw that 46% year over year increase in enrollment. We have a key performance indicator at the number of units attempted in your first term. So we set it at 12. We went from 11.4 up to 12.6 now. So again, those are all things that contribute to FTS. And then the other indicator that we have within student services, and obviously these are shared metrics, they don't just live in student services, they're shared with academic affairs, is around completion. So the year-over-year increase for ADTs awarded to Pell students went up 34%, and for Promise students went up 29% from the previous year. And so we did very targeted things where we downloaded data and we identified Pell eligible students who were between 45 and 60 units. It was about 1,500 students, and the counselors reached out and called them in and met with them and helped them apply for graduation. So we did these very targeted things that would all translate to more funding in the new funding formula. So whether it's, I mean, I want to think like all of these things are really positive, even though it might seem disingenuous because you could say we're chasing the funding, but we're not. These are good things for students. And so we're really happy about the things that we've been able to support. And so pretty much 4 of my 5 VP area priorities that were identified in my plan are directly tied to the student-centered funding formula. There's only one metric and that's the mental health metric, that's not necessarily tied to the funding formula.
And one question, where do you find this data? Is it in NPAS, or is this reported to the Student Success Report Card?
You mean the data that I just mentioned?
Yes.
So in my VP plan, what I've done is I've set up dashboards with institutional effectiveness. So they're actually public dashboards. You can go and see the direct high school matriculation dashboard anytime you want. And so these dashboards are set up for our area to be able to monitor our ongoing progress towards these goals. So they come from institutional effectiveness, and so they're the ones that kind of set up these numbers. I also have, obviously, like the mental health isn't a public dashboard, so we have to use some like internal like SARS data, and that's reported from the clinicians. But for the most part, these are all numbers that come directly from institutional effectiveness, and we have Tableau dashboards that help us monitor some of, at least from my area, some of the goals that we're looking at. And I'm sure Dr. Scott has Tableau dashboards as well set up.
Yeah, Trustee Ntuk, I wanted to tell you on our 3-year metrics, these came out of institutional effectiveness, and they go into our VP plans. So the 4 of us have a VP AA or whatever plan, and so we close the loop, we look at what happened last year, we look at how we performed up against the goal, we create new goals. This year, we decided to do 3-year metrics in my area. So we've reached some of them, we haven't reached other ones, but yeah, it's all part of our planning process. It's required for accreditation, and we have large committees, and they come and they sit and they listen to our presentations, and it's part of what we do on an annual basis.
Where is student receivables tracked? Where does that fall in, the metric for that?
So we're talking about the debt students could potentially owe us for their fees. That falls in my area. I will tell you, we write off about $400,000 a year in uncollectible debt. We are hoping that with NELNET and the ability to make payments, students are less likely to get behind because it does impair a student's ability to return to us in a future semester. We are working collaboratively to look at when we drop for non-payment, at what threshold should we drop. We want to make it one that makes sense that student is meaningfully enrolled, but one that does not allow them to encourage debt. But there is a certain level of that. And so when we have a student who doesn't pay, it does appear as debt. And if it goes long enough, we eventually will write it off. And before I leave the student-centered formula, I want to just point out one very interesting dynamic as we're in this process. So we're working hard to increase enrollment. We're working hard to support completions. And as you heard Dr. Scott say earlier, sometimes that means having classes with not as much fill rate as we want because we want to have the capstone. You heard Dr. Munoz talk a lot about the additional services we're providing these students. Remember, until we exit Hold Harmless, we don't really have any increase in funding except for COLA. So that's really an interesting dynamic. Before the formula, we have more students, we get more money. Yay. We don't right now. We only get the COLA. And so that's part of our decision making. We have to allocate resources to these improvements, but it does mean that you will be seeing higher costs for systems. You're going to see higher costs for labor in some cases, that those all represent our efforts to bring in more students and to better serve them.
And of course, economists are predicting a recession, which will also impact us, and hopefully our enrollment will increase with that, because when the economy is bad, everybody goes back to school for retraining. Earlier in the meeting, you quoted information from Anderson School of Management, and was that COLA related? It was you'd mentioned something.
Yeah, they were talking about
4-year.
Yeah, they were talking about the economy. They do project some inflation rates, but they were as concerned as everybody else is, including the Fed, about the Treasury market, which is typically a big indicator of when we're in a recession. But greater than that, our economic predictors have been unpredictable.
No, that's true.
It is an oxymoron, but we have unpredictable predictors. And so it is very difficult to anticipate what's going to happen. Our stock market has been very emotional. And we see some longer lasting impacts from some global economic issues, including Brexit, including the tariff issues. And so there is just a lot of concern, and the greater concern we have, the more it affects our stock market. And so I think we can anticipate, just from a natural cycle, we eventually have to end economic growth period. It can't last forever. But the question is, when is that, and how do we prepare? And I think your discussion about a rainy day fund is completely appropriate.
I'm curious to know if that's just information that you cited from Anderson, just that came across your desk, or if we have a partnership with them, or if they're just sending out information to all the colleges.
They're a recognized expert, and I think my fellow CBOs probably catch their releases as frequently as I do. It's one of the areas we track.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm a graduate of one of the Anderson programs.
I'm happy to
So-
share them with you. I'm
I'd
happy
like
to
to
share
see
them with
that.
all of you. Yes.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And so next, we're going to look at our expenditures, and it's no surprise that we are a service agency. We are salaries and benefits. That's where we spend our money, far and above every other unit. And you can see that our biggest change is in salaries and benefits, that we are projecting increases over unaudited actuals. Again, I believe that we'll be able to achieve savings here because we are continuing our reorganization, but we can't save everything. We do have to bring on 14 new faculty because of our faculty obligation number. So that's one of the challenges on the cost side that we get from the funding formula. We're not getting more funding for these extra students, but as we increase enrollment, we are required to hire new full-time faculty. And I will also tell you, once we're under the funding formula, I see a big problem because we're funded on a 3-year average, but the FON is based on 1 year. So if you're growing, your growth is doled by a 3-year average. But for the FON, it is not. So there's a natural imbalance, and I'm hoping in the next 3 years we find a solution. We also had negotiated increases in our collective bargaining agreement. Full-time faculty had negotiated 1.85% increase. The classified union had an amount equal to the COLA. And then we see the impact of STRS and PERS, $2.6 million for those alone. Very significant. We do show an increase in contract services and operating expenses. I mentioned we had a big savings at the end of the year. We conservatively budget for these. We know we will not spend every contract to its max, but when you create a contract, you want to have room in there so that you can move. So we will always have savings, but we also are expanding services. We are forging ahead with new things, and we can see increases there. And then lastly, we do have some one-time expenditures to support a lot of the things we've been talking about systems-wide. So when we look at our 7-year trend in particularly with salaries and benefits, you can see it's been a rocky road, and I think the chart shows it even better. Truly, anything above 85% in our industry is a danger zone for us, and we've been focusing on salaries and benefits. However, it's going to continue to be a challenge while we're implementing the student-centered funding formula because of those things I just mentioned. So it just means we have to be very tightly controlling with our salaries cost in order to not let them get away from us. And I'm happy to report that we are projecting, even with the deficit, salaries below the 90% range, which is a big deal for us. And the STRS and PERS, we've been previewing it, we've been giving it all kinds of trailers, and here we are, it's finally hitting. When we look at our change over 18-19, it's not as bad as it was. And when I talk about a $2 million hit and say that's not as bad as it was, that's saying a lot. We are going to get some relief. It should cap out at 22, 23, and I say should because if the funds continue to not perform, and if they're still upside down, they'll have to find another solution. But when we look at the total, just the cumulative total at the very bottom, that $12 million, that means today we spend $12 million more in STRS and PERS than we did 9 years ago. $12 million today. The benefit is to the funds, and by extension to our employees because they have more secure retirement. But that solution, which wasn't created by educational agencies, has been solved by then. And that goes to your question earlier, President Malauulu, about what's causing, what's driving that deficit spending, and it is this, and you'll see the same pattern at many other institutional agencies. And then when we look out, we always project out 2 years. The further out you project, the less accurate you are. You're making some really broad assumptions. The good news here is, and I think this mirrors when you look going back to STRS and PERS, and you see those increases in costs decreasing, and in the matter of STRS actually having a reduction, you can see the impact on our deficit spending. There's a correlation there. It's not because we're being irresponsible, it's because we have these external changes to the degree that it's difficult to manage. And the fact that we're taking this opportunity to get leaner, to reorganize, to restructure is great because not only are we improving our budget, but we're improving how we operate. And then I wanted to touch base on all the other funds. We talk a lot about the unrestricted general fund because that's our operations, that's what we do. But these other funds are really critical, and if one of these funds got too upside down, it could endanger our fiscal solvency because it would be on the unrestricted general fund to solve the problem. In your handouts that I gave you tonight are the most updated budgets we have for these different funds, and I just wanted to give you a little bit more information about each one of them. The restricted general fund contains all of those restricted programs from financial aid to an itty-bitty little grant. And so those funds, you either have to do something specific to get, or once you get it, you have to do something very specific. Federal funds, state funds, local funds. And so in that program, you'll almost always see expenditures very close to what the revenue is because we anticipate spending it. The biggest challenge in that fund is to manage carryover funds. You mentioned earlier, President Malauulu, using it or losing it. A lot of these programs, if you don't spend it within a certain amount of time, you lose it. And a lot of these programs, the fiscal year is different than ours. So sometimes when you look at the ending fund balance, it's a little strange. ASB, obviously, we maintain that for our ASB. They control it. We have a lot of controls. We had a really successful workshop last year with FICMAT coming in and talking about it. We'll bring them out again this year. Capital projects. That contains the state funding we get for our buildings because that funding doesn't go into bond funds. It sits in capital projects. But we also have money in there that we're funding ourselves, big programs that aren't bond funds. Child and adult development is primarily our child development centers. The community education fund, that's when we're doing some entrepreneurship type of programs. I really want to hit the bond funds. The bond funds are unique, and I get questions every year. How come we budgeted, almost $1 billion and we didn't spend very much? We budget the entire bond because in the 2041 master plan, we decided how much we were going to dedicate to each of those projects. So that budget, every year we budget all of them. We make adjustments throughout the year, and by the end of the year, you'll see what we actually spent. So by the end of the year, it shows what we spent, and then the next year, we budget it all again. That's the process because we actually have budgets for each of those. It looks odd, but it helps us track each of those projects. The retiree health fund, a portion of that fund is in an irrevocable trust because we have set aside monies to ensure that we have those post-employment retiree benefits for all of our retirees. We also do a little bit of a pay-as-you-go to help support that. Financial aid obviously is maintained in a separate fund, and that's expressly for the purpose of servicing financial aid. And I wanted to last mention the stadium operations. This is in a separate fund. A lot of the revenues we make from our Civic Center Act facility use agreements, so think the antique swap meet, the motorcycle swap meet, those funds help us maintain that stadium and all the parking lots, as well as the staff. That budget is perfectly balanced, very little surplus, very little deficit in each year. You will see an increase in the expenditures in upcoming years because we are adding to event staff because we are doing more, but again, it's going to be a wash. The idea from the Civic Center Act is that we're not making money off of allowing the public to use our facilities. We're sharing with them because they pay for it. And that's why it's necessary to charge, because typically we're recovering costs. We're not making money. So when we look at our cloudy crystal ball and try to determine where are we going to hit, there's a lot of things that are concerning, but I think we're doing a lot of things that are great. That $3.6 million deficit, really only $2.6 million ongoing, is far less than we'd projected in either of the last 2 years. And we do have specific plans in place to address that on an ongoing basis. We are concerned about the state's ability to appropriate enough funds to fund community colleges. There was an effort this year to get a continuous appropriation so they wouldn't fall short. It was not successful. So that is our hope going forward, to get that change. But in the meantime, the ability of the state to fund all of us means we have to continue to budget at least minimally for a potential deficit. And then, of course, for all of those student-centered funding formula concerns we talked about that our work to improve, we've been very, very successful, but we won't see the monetary results for a couple of years. So I hope you found that very helpful. I know it was a very deep dive, but if you have any other questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
This isn't a question, it's just a comment. And this is credit to the entire team that's here regarding the largest graduating class. The numbers that we were initially given were actually more conservative than what the numbers were. So we had the largest graduating class, and then it ended up being even bigger than that because I think it went up by a couple hundred more, and the certificates that were awarded. And I think that we need to get that message out into the community. So we were super happy, and we were celebrating. I think I took some notes, and I think that the numbers reported were 1925 and 316 for students eligible with the associate degree and the certificate. But I think the actual numbers were actually 2173 and then 395. So we reported the largest class, but actually, we really should be celebrating an even bigger number than what was there. So I know that a lot of things happen after the fact, and I know a lot of students pick up and, paperwork happens in classes and grade changes. I remember all that. But this team should really be commended, and I think that message should get out because I personally, and this is, really sad and unfortunate, but this is just the culture that we live in. I personally had people say to me, like, that's impossible, that's not possible, and no, you didn't, and no, you couldn't have. And it's so nice to be able to say, actually, it was even bigger than what we originally said. So that's fantastic. In terms of budgeting, congratulations to the team, because I know that helps a lot. Dr. O'Malley, you wanted to respond?
Thank you very much. That really means a lot to us. Everyone, the whole school has been working so hard. You are correct. We purposely underestimated to have a safety net for grade fails or grade changes. Last thing we wanted to do was oversell. We will be announcing the final numbers tomorrow night. We are so excited. That's okay. It's okay.
Oops.
You deserve
Surprise.
the announcement. You deserve the announcement.
I
We're gonna
jumped
have
the gun.
It's okay. We're gonna have some slides tomorrow. It's gonna be a real celebration. We were about 27% last year, so I love it when people don't believe in us, because that gives us an opportunity to prove them wrong. And I say, come on with the disbelief. We'll just prove you wrong every time. So you are 100% right. Our students are awesome. There has been not one piece of the organization that hasn't been touched by our efforts. You're seeing little things, doodads happening here, there, and everywhere. We've looked at virtually every piece of the organization. And the magic is when you do that, it starts to multiply and multiply, and it becomes a snowball. So look out next year.
Appreciate that. Any other questions or comments before we move on to the next item? Yes, sir.
Just on closing out the budget, I recently part of the LA County Trustee Association and conversations about preparing for the recession and what tools are out there. And I think about, we are in this longest recovery. The 2009 Stimulus Act worked, and we haven't had another recession. But one of the things that happened was stress tests. A lot of the banks were required to say, okay, if you were in this diminished state, how would you perform? And one of the tools that came up in our conversation is the FCMAT analysis that can be done, where you can do an analysis of your budget, and it gives you a percentage that you can compare against other districts, or you can compare against your strength versus your weakness, and it kind of can tell you a pathway that maybe help guide, maybe the rainy day fund boost our FCMAT score or not. But it would be a great assessment, or I don't know what the process is for us to do it, as far as a financial tool that we might be able to talk about when the budget comes back next month. Or is that already been done and we just didn't talk about it today?
FCMAT has a 14-point, actually I think they've added more. It used to be a 5-point assessment tool, and now they've added a great amount to it. We can certainly do a self-evaluation and bring it forward. It does show you some red flag areas. It shows you areas you can improve upon, but it can be very, very useful. Yeah.
Is it a difficult assessment to do? Does it take a lot of time, or is it just doing some calculations?
It's a combination. Some of the questions are straightforward. Some of the questions require calculation, and some of the questions require a very frank look at how our district operates. So the questionnaire, because budgets really are a reflection of the district at its core, do ask questions that can be challenging to answer.
What's the staff's perspective on the best timing and when to do, or when would it be helpful for us? Is it after the budget? Is it something that would take weeks to do or days to do?
I believe after the budget adoption that it would be a good exercise to go through, perhaps with the financial data completed, and then bringing it forward for some of the other answers, but definitely sometime prior to budget development for the following fiscal year.
Yeah, I agree with that. I actually used to do some work for FCMAT. They're absolutely outstanding and have done some of these before the 14 points, back when in the days of the 5-point. And they are very, very helpful. They cause you to ask some really good, strong questions. And I would say once we put this budget to bed in September and get it loaded in and everything for the new year, perhaps October, November, it would be a great thing to do for next year.
Looking at the documents we have, and as we get closer, is there going to be a line item that we can see how much is for the Office of Basic Needs and homeless students? I know we're somewhat high level, but where do we see those type of line item budget allocations or expectations for next year?
Great question. When we approach budgeting, and what you get for your budgets is a summarized budget. So, and it's summarized by fund and shows all the expenditures and revenue sources for that fund. When you look at the restricted fund, you can see a lot of the specific funding for each individual purpose. That doesn't always reflect all the costs in that area. So we assign department codes to budget. So imagine hundreds of department codes, and with each one of those department codes, you'll see expenditures and budgets. So for instance, my department code is not huge because it's me, my salary, my executive assistant, and our related travel and supplies. But if you looked at fiscal services department code, then that contains all the folks operating in there and all the related expenditures. And so you take that and you replicate it and you get a very, very large budget. Each program manager is responsible for managing their department budget, and we do look at them at that close level, and I'm always happy to bring forward to you department budgets for those areas you're really interested in. They don't always align specifically with how we think about programs, because sometimes we operate programs cross-functionally. So we might have funding for this specific purpose, for a program for Guardian Scholars, for instance. And we might know that that would operate really closely, and forgive me, Dr. Munoz, if I'm talking about your area of expertise, but from a budgetary standpoint, if it operates very closely with something else, they might not be distinctly identified in the budget. They might have different sources. You can have one department with more than one source, but if they can cohabitate, if they can share staff, you might be splitting one staff member 50% from this funding source, 50% from that. So sometimes how we think of the program externally doesn't always align exactly with the budget, because the budget follows the dollars. But we can certainly bring forward to you those specific departments and then walk you through how they might look a little different on the budget side.
Especially things we voted on. Like what is our allocation for transportation, for North Long Beach, for homeless housing, just to get a better idea of, I know we have money, we talk about we're going to do things, but how much and what did we agree to, because it's somewhat in the fine print.
Yeah. Well, and bus passes, I'm glad you brought that up, is a really good example, because it's not a standalone program, it's not a standalone department, and it actually represents funding from 3 different sources. So in that case, we'll create for you a summary of what that expenditure looks like.
And especially I'm looking at our goals and priority pages. It was like 10 and 11, or I guess, sorry, maybe slides 8 through 12. You know, we have checked off, it meets these categories, but how much are we actually spending to improve the website or our early college program? It would be good to have some numbers and better understanding of positions connected to that. So thank you.
All right, anyone else? Okay, so moving on the agenda, I just want to confirm that item 1.6 is a separate presentation, or did you cover everything all at once?
We talked about item 1.6. It is a separate presentation, but my presentation is going to be very short for you.
All right, let's have it.
We were asked to bring forward a summary of what we were doing with the business process reviews, because the $6 million pot of money has been sitting out there. And I think in the early years after we got it, we had a couple starts and stops as we were looking at system implementation. It's really ramped up, and we've become far more focused on what we need to do immediately. But as I said earlier, not nearly all the systems we're implementing are reflected here, because we are using other sources of funding. So what you have in this list on the front page are things we've already done. Some to greater success, some to lesser success, but things we've already done. But when you go to page 2, and this is the handout for the BPRs, you'll see what we're anticipating for 1920 through 21-22. So these are the things we anticipate spending money on. In 18-19, we didn't spend all the money we thought we were going to spend. We slowed down a little bit. We were making big changes, and the systems we were implementing were really affecting a lot of systems. And we knew that we had a big PeopleSoft upgrade happening over Thanksgiving this year. And so we need to wait for that to happen, do some more system modifications. But I have to say, I have phenomenal colleagues, and we spend a lot of time very productively talking about the various needs for systems and identifying which ones are priorities and setting out those steps. And so what you see here is the result of those conversations. And so we're looking at catalog software. I think we've had a lot of conversations about catalog software over the past year. Degree planning, big deal. Benefit administration. We have a person doing everything manually like it was 1984. Position management, we talked about that. Contracts management, again, that's a largely manual process that if we had some just using a system, then that person could dedicate their time and energy into maybe improving our contracts or making more lean contracts. So it's not about reducing people all the time, it's about making better use of our time. And so we're really excited to bring this forward. You'll also see that we are continuing to strengthen our network. That's also a big focus. But we will have expenditures beyond here. But I think to your point earlier, Trustee Otto, capacity, we have a lot of conversations about capacity, but I think we are well positioned to meet these goals over the next 2 years.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments on item 1.6? Is there anything additional on the budget? All right, we're going to go to the adjournment, and we will see everyone back here tomorrow night for our regularly scheduled monthly board meeting. It is 7:10, and this meeting is now adjourned. Thank you all, and thank you to staff. You did a great job, really good job. Thank you.